Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be doing some further analysis of the Xbox 720 and PS4's hardware specifications. More to the point, I'm going to be answering a few questions that I've recently been receiving, both on YouTube itself and via Facebook. By the way, guys, Facebook is generally, as I've mentioned before, the better way to contact me. But it pretty much comes down to several people have commented, why have both Sony and Microsoft ended up at roughly the same place in terms of pure hardware specifications. Now obviously there are some deviances between the two consoles, most predominantly in the amount of GCN cores, or shall we say graphics card power, combined with the type of RAM being used. However, in most cases it's very interchangeable. So if we were to say look at the processor, it seems both are going to be using the Jaguar. Now I'd hasten to add, in the case of the Xbox 720, when it's finally announced, hopefully late May, possibly E3, we could actually find the specifications are completely different to what has been rumoured. But I can only go with what's been rumoured, and I just want to clear up some various bits and pieces. Now in a previous video, which I believe was entitled something along the lines of why console manufacturers choose their hardware that they do, I'll actually give a link to it. I actually went through heavily on the processes of, the manufacturing and the design decisions of console manufacturers. However, I didn't really go down some of the routes maybe I should have, so I just want to make a shorter video, this one, which is going to clarify why Microsoft and Sony have ended up at pretty much the same place. Now, for those of you who don't want to watch the other video, or maybe have watched and don't really remember it too well, or what have you, I'll just quickly get us up to speed. There's a few reasons that they've ended up like this in terms of need, and those needs are pretty simple actually. When you're designing a console, there are several conditions and criteria that must be satisfied for that console to not only function, but to be successful. Now the first condition and criteria, if you will, would be a very simple one. Price. Now price is, to be honest with you, a very flexible, it's an elastic demand. In other words, a company can choose to either eat some of the cost, if you will, of the hardware. In other words, it can either sell the hardware at, say, a loss in some cases, say the original Xbox, or at a profit, for example the original Wii, or kind of middling. In other words, it doesn't cost them anything, but it's not actually making them any money either. Now, generally speaking, as the processes of manufacturing the various components inside, for example the GPU or the, let's say CPU, are refined, those costs do come down. So in other words, it costs the console manufacturer more to manufacture and create the console at the start than what it does, say, 4 years down the line. Hence one of the reasons that it can actually bring down the price of the console. Fair enough, right? So, as I said, cost is one of them. Now, they can, of course, price the console at various price points. They can, make it $20 if they so desire, but they can also make it, $2,000. But realistically, that is a price point that they know that their target audience can likely afford or be willing to afford. In other words, how much the consumer, is willing to stomach. Now, getting away from price and probably onto the more technical side, once again, I've mentioned this heavily in the other previous video that I just talked about, but you've got to remember that there are two real main concerns when developing a console. The first is heat and power. Now, I put those under the same bracket because reality of the matter is heat is a direct result of power. In other words, the more power a device consumes, generally speaking, the more heat that device will automatically produce. Very simple. If you were to look at, say, the parts of, let's go with the GTX 480, the actual die on that is pretty damn big, and more to the point, it sucks a lot of juice out of a PSU. If you were to compare that in terms of the actual idle temperature, you'll notice that it's a lot more, they produce a lot more heat, let's just go with that, than say the GTX 500 series. Say the GTX 480 produces more heat than say the GTX 570, which in terms of cores are actually very similar. However, the GTX 570 has a slightly more refined core architecture, despite the fact that it actually has less memory bandwidth. So even so, you're going to notice that the GTX 570, for example, draws less heat, even though speed-wise it's fairly comparable, though it does have slightly less memory than the GTX 480, which means in some cases it does actually lose out. So we know about heat and power, and this is very true in the case of either laptop manufacturing or, for example, say the iPad or any tablet device really, cell phones of course, any device that requires a battery really, because obviously it has a shelf life. In other words, that battery needs to power a device for a minimal amount of time. After all, if you're using, say, a cell phone, you don't want it to go dead in 2 hours, right? But on a console, it's not quite such a big deal. Obviously, it's plugged into the main / power supply / whatever. But even so, it cannot use too much power because of the simple reasons that it will produce too much heat. And the more heat you have, the more heat you have to get rid of. In other words, the more intricate and the more complicated the cooling system becomes, and the more cooling you require, conversely, the bigger the actual case becomes, because, well, it becomes heavier, and so on. So you get the idea. The next is fairly simple as well, in terms of you need to be able to significantly better the previous generation in terms of raw power. And by power, I mean actual performance. In other words, if that console is, I don't know, 20% more, fast than, let's say, the previous Xbox. Let's say the Xbox 720 was like 25% faster, for example. Who's going to care? It's not really going to sell that well. People are just going to be disappointed. It could fit on, it could fit in the palm of your hand, but if it's supposed to connect to the TV, no one's really going to care. So it has to actually be of a decent jump, shall we say, which is one of the reasons it takes so long for these devices to come to fruition and therefore to be at the bottom of your TV. So we know that in the case of Sony, when they were shopping around for parts, they decided that the best option would likely be an x86 type of architecture. More to the point, they actually were very smart and they decided to ask developers. However, once again, they cannot simply go up to Epic or whomever and say to them, hey guys, we're actually wanting to design a new console. What do you reckon we should have in the PlayStation 4? Could you note it down, please? No, you can't do that for obvious reasons. Leaks would be galore right off the bat. It would alert all of your competitors. It just doesn't make any sense. So instead, they phrased it as a series of questions, and a questionnaire was formed and then sent out. And those questions were quite ingenious in that they were very vague, but they got the point across, and Sony were able to build a system based upon that. So, for example, they would ask questions like, what do you expect? What do you want in the next generation of engines? What do you want for those engines to be able to do? What do you realistically expect of the next generation engines? What do you expect of next generation games? And they would even ask something like, what would you expect in platforms that you are developing for? In other words, they're kind of giving them almost like a wish list, I suppose, in a way. And there were a number of things that were top of these wishes, if you want, these desires, and RAM was one of them. Now I'm going to very quickly diverge for a moment onto the subject of the previous generation, or current generation if you so wish, the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Now, both systems were actually reasonable in terms of the GPU and CPU. Yes, the PS3 was little bit tricky to program for, but the reality of the matter is you could get around it. In other words, if you knew the system well enough, you could get the most out of the cell processor. And to a certain degree, you can even get around the limitations of RAM. But the reality of the matter is there is only a finite amount of resources. In other words, once you've taken into OS overheads, in other words, there is a certain amount of memory that is restricted to the operating systems, as you guys probably know by now. You can't actually go past that. You can do tricks to make the system not need certain textures at some point. You can best utilize the cache. You can use low resolution textures in the distance and have them pop in as you get closer. You can reduce the resolution of the games are running in, which also helps. You can do multiple tricks, but the reality of the matter is, the cold, harsh reality, you can pray, you can beg, and you can scream, but there is a finite amount of RAM on those systems, and unfortunately, it wasn't enough. Several developers have actually gone on record and said, you know what, the actual GPU and the CPU on the systems, okay, it was getting a bit long in the tooth, but the reality is we could have done a lot more. We could have really soldiered a lot better if these guys had given us more RAM. Dishonored developers had said that quite a bit had to actually be cut out of their vision for the game, simply because there wasn't the memory to do it. And this is also the case of, say, The Witcher and various other titles as well. So, right there, you can almost guarantee that Microsoft would have done very similar. They may have not have done it exactly the same way, but they would have certainly started to ask around to developers, including of course their own in-house developers as well, which of course they could be more free to ask questions with. So you can imagine right now that the designers already have a very base start. Now, 8 gigabytes of RAM is a very good starting point. Most PCs now have very similar amounts. Obviously, the thing with PCs, however, they do have that dedicated VRAM, that video RAM, which does help things substantially. Most cards now have at least 1 gig. Some have, 1.5, some have 2, some have 3, whatever. As it turns out, most cards now at 1080p, 2 gigs is more than enough. And indeed, in most cases, 1.5 gigs is actually generally fine, unless you're really heavily bombarding it with very, very high multi-monitor resolutions. Obviously, we don't know what it's going to be like in, say, 2 years' time, but we can only discuss for now. So, as I was saying, this really opens up a couple of issues, and they are mostly that you need to be able to really hit the ground running with a very decent specification that is easy to program for. Both systems previously used a derivative of the PowerPC architecture. The Xbox 360 CPU is definitely easier to use, but in reality, it still wasn't as easy as maybe they could have wanted. And so, likelihood is, at least in the case of Sony, that an x86/64-bit architecture was most likely going to be the best course of action. Now at the moment, PCs, the average game is actually a 32-bit application. This means that in reality it can only actually address a certain amount of memory to the operating system. This is very similar to if you were to run a 32-bit operating system on a system that has, let's say, 16 gigs of RAM. It will only be able to address a certain percent of that. For example, Windows 8 on a 64-bit CPU could be, for example, 128 gigs of RAM. This would be the standard edition and not the professional edition. On the other hand, on an x86 type of architecture, it's actually 4 gigs. So you can imagine the difference. Actually, on the enterprise version as well as the pro versions, it's 512 gigabytes. But once again, on the enterprise and professional versions of the x86, it's only 4 gigs. And this is the same thing as many game applications now are actually only 32-bit. So in other words, they can only address 4 gigs of RAM on the PC. So this is one of the reasons, actually, as a slight aside, that Skyrim on the PC, when it first was launched, I don't know if you guys remember it, but there was actual crashes at launch if you decided to mod the game. Now, shortly after the game was launched, of course, texture mods were automatically popping up very quickly, because everyone just wanted to jump on the Skyrim bandwagon to release mods, and some of them, to be fair, were really good. Unfortunately, if you had some of those mods installed, if you had quite a few mods installed especially, the game would either hang on loading or just crash. And that's actually because Bethesda, in their infinite wisdom, I have no idea why, maybe it was just a kind of hangover code from the console version, or maybe they just didn't really account for mods, or maybe it was a bug or whatever, but it only actually addressed up to 2 gigs. And then they released a patch after users had created hotfixes that allowed the game to address up to 4, which for the most part fixed crashes unless you're running ridiculously high resolution texture mods, and even then I believe it's fixed it. They may have released subsequent patches, I'm not sure, I haven't really looked after that, but certainly last time I looked 4 gigs was fine. So as I was saying, really on PCs, 8 gigs of RAM on system is more than enough, especially when you take into account, well, video memory as well. So for consoles, it made very much a great deal of sense to go with 8 gigs. Even though with consoles they are unified memory, so obviously you don't have that dedicated memory pool, at least, well, we're assuming so on the case of the Xbox. For all we know, there is a 50 gigabyte reserve of VRAM, we don't know. But let's assume it's not, just for the purposes of this, and let's go with the rumoured specifications that 8 gigabytes is unified. In which case, that even so, 8 gigs is more than enough for applications such as Unreal and whatever else to run absolutely fine in 1080p, which is the target resolution for these systems. Remember, they are not going to be running, dual or tri-monitor setups. For example, what you can do with, say, NVIDIA Surround if you happen to be running a NVIDIA system, or same with AMD's various display modes as well. Okay, so we know the rough kind of requirements there in terms of RAM and CPU as well. They needed a low power device, as I've mentioned in that previous video that I mentioned earlier, why they choose the parts they do. So how come they ended up at the same place? That's the purpose of the video, and I haven't really answered it yet. Well, it's actually relatively simple, as it turns out. There are only a certain amount of choices in terms of both hardware and actual manufacturers to produce the hardware that you can go with. So in the case of either console manufacturer, they were to obviously have looked at the various choices and they would have said, well, AMD are probably the best one to go with here. Why? Well, Intel, if you were to look at Intel's current product offerings, are actually very fast. Their CPUs are certainly faster than AMD's. That's just a fact. That's not fanboy comment. You can feel free to Google any of this stuff yourself. Their actual raw specs for their desktop units are faster than what AMD's are. Now, obviously, there are certain applications that AMD certainly are very competitive, but we are talking about overall performance here. So, obviously, that's what we're going to be really focused upon. However, the integrated graphics systems of Intel, despite the fact it's improved from Sandy to Ivy to Haswell, it still isn't up there, is what it comes down to, and it's not good enough for gaming, at least in console terms. It's not going to be able to produce, the graphics that we as gamers really expect. So they're kind of out for an APU, which means that you could go with, say, Intel and, for example, NVIDIA to provide the graphics. That's certainly an option, which the original Xbox did, for example. But the problem with that is then you're losing, shall I say, the APU functionality. NVIDIA have its own range of semi-APUs and, the Tegra systems and so on, but it doesn't give the performance that's really required. Similarly, they are not up to the architectural standards that consoles are going to want, and they are not really the type of CPUs that they are looking for. Despite the fact that NVIDIA's GPUs are very good, they don't really lend themselves to the GCN philosophy. So, reality of the matter is, although we could spend a little bit of time discussing this further, the reality and the simple truth of this is AMD were the better option. They had a very cheap, in terms of cost to buy off of AMD, and very low power device, the Jaguar, and it was relatively brain dead, really, for them to combine this with the Southern Islands, the 7000 range. So those are basically the reasons. The APU that was then formed, and there are videos on this explaining more what an APU is, was pretty much kind of a given. And AMD themselves have actually very much gambled a lot of their future on their company on an APU. Because they believe that Fusion, which is what they are pretty much calling this, that CPUs are obviously better at certain tasks, but GPUs are better at others, so they believe that a fusion of those two things, if you will, an amalgamation on the same die, which is pretty much what an APU is, with some jiggery pokery in there, a SoC, if you will, system on a chip, that was the best solution. And in this case, on this system, because they're going with such low power devices, because they need that grunt, and an APU is pretty much really what they needed. So to answer your simple question, or sorry, answer your question simply, should I say, it is pretty much a case of if you were to split a team of engineers right down the middle, and you were to ask those two teams to create a product that has exact same goals, they will most likely, if they're given the same type of resources, create a very similar product, or a very similar solution in this case, simply because there is only a finite number of items they can do. They could start to actually design their own chips, which Sony have obviously done some customizations, for example, on the Jaguar. But reality of the matter is, they're not really going to want to do that. It slows down production time, it increases the chance that stuff is going to not work right. It's better to let another company do this, is really what it comes down to. So in that case, it's better just to take as much off-the-shelf stuff as possible. I'm not saying literally you go down to, your local whatever company you happen to buy stuff from, and you buy stuff off the shelf and throw it together, but in reality they are using as much off the shelf stuff as possible, because it just means that they can actually get on with making sure that everything works correctly. So it's pretty much a limitation on the items that they had, combined with a cheap budget. Because remember, it's not like the budget that we are talking about. In other words, the cost of that, $400, for example, for the PS4. It's not like that money is only going to buy the APU and the RAM and the hard drive. It has to do a lot more. It has to also pay for the controller. It has to pay for the casing of the system. I know that's a pretty crappy example. It has to pay for any of the cables that are in there. It has to pay for the warranty. In other words, if you have to ship it back, it has to pay shipping costs. It has to pay for the actual shop itself to stock it, and they have to respectively make a profit upon that. It has to go for the operating system functionalities, the development of all of that. It even has to go down to simple things such as screws and nuts and bolts and various other bits and bobs that actually go into it, even the disk drives, for example. So in other words, they need to make the product as cheap as possible and basically perform as best as possible. So once again, this has been a kind of a retelling of a few videos I've already done, but I just wanted to create one video that really went into this stuff specifically in terms of why they both ended up at this particular location, because previously I had kind of dealt with both systems as component parts, so I just wanted to go through that. If you guys want more information on what an APU is, there is a video that's basically titled "What is an APU?" Which very heavily goes into what a Jaguar is. There's also a video, as I said, why they choose the parts they do, which very much goes in depth onto the choices and the design decisions of actually making a console. I'm going to be doing quite a few other videos over the next couple of days, as you'd expect. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and some of you may know this stuff, some of you may not, but regardless, hopefully it's been a bit of an interesting journey for you. Anyway, I'm going to call this video. So, as usual, leave comments below. If you've got questions, however, don't take it personally. I might not respond to the comments. It's not anything personal. It's just that I have literally received dozens upon dozens upon dozens of comments per day, and I do try to read them, I honestly do, but there are several of us running the channel, including Amata, Spoony sometimes, and even Murasaki, and therefore at times they will have read the message quite by accident. It pops up and they'll just read it, and then they'll just forget to tell me or what have you, or even myself, I just can't deal with all the messages. Therefore, if you're unsure of something, or you want another video created, or you just want a quick answer or whatever to a question, it's often better to either message specifically on YouTube, so go ahead and fire up for the message, or just go to Facebook, Red Gaming Tech on Facebook, and then you can just simply message that way, and I will endeavour to answer any questions as quickly as possible. And I like to do so. It really does, you know, I really do like to give information as much as possible. But, yeah, I have an absolute plethora of things to do today, so hopefully you guys are going to enjoy the content. I have some really special stuff coming up that is going to be really exciting. I know I've been saying that for a while now, but we have some really cool stuff that we want to be doing actual physically, and by which I don't mean like a Rocky training montage or anything, but I'm talking about kind of like new ways to present videos and so forth. Unfortunately, it requires physical labor on our parts, and that actually really boils down to time. So I'm hoping to just be able to kind of cane that out over the next couple of weeks. I need to buy some other bits and pieces as well in terms of electrical equipment, but it shouldn't be too difficult once we kind of get our hands in there. Anyway, once again, if you're able to like the video or dislike it if you didn't enjoy it, comment if you want, and subscribe to the channel or share it, whatever. I'll leave it down to you guys, of course. So take care and bye for now.
You should sit down or something. Try to